Let me say that I am extremely honored to have been invited in this illustrious circle of colleagues to give this talk today in Rome. I feel extremely privileged to be here, so thank you very much for the lovely invitation. Especially because I'm talking about something, a project which I have not yet completed. It's still a work in progress, but quite advanced in progress. And so what I would like to talk about today is that project. I will be looking at dress identities of women and men, although by and large I will focus more on the tomb portraits of women for reasons that will become very obvious, I hope, in the course of the talk. Now, when we think of textiles in the Roman imperial period, we know that consumers were more likely to purchase their textiles from shops. Textiles were woven in workshops by both women and men, as the epigraphy tells us. And when we look at visual depictions of such sale scenes of textiles, and we can see two of them here and one a colorized version, we can see the types of brightly colored and ornate textiles that would have been displayed to customers coming into the shops. Nevertheless, in the Roman imperial period, there was a somewhat nostalgic view that the woman of the house should spin the wool and make the clothing for the household. Even Augustus claimed this, and I don't believe it for 1 second, but he did claim this, that his wife Livia made all of the textiles and clothing for the family. What we have in funerary monuments around the Roman world, except in Italy, are depictions such as these two at the bottom. Everywhere from Britain to Syria, we find these depictions of women holding a spindle and distaff in their hands to indicate both industriousness, but also conformity to the old social idea of the woman as the producer of textiles. That was very different in the pre-Roman period. In the pre-Roman period, the spinning of raw wool was a gendered task, as the iconography of the period indicates. And I draw your attention to the image on the upper left from Pestum, where the mistress of the house is holding a spindle and distaff, and a servant holds a basket for the balls of wool. The context of loom weights in high-status residences and in burials of elite women has been interpreted as an indication that since the early Iron Age, weaving was the prerogative of the indigenous dominant elites, and that women of this social class were the textile workers. I think we have to also say that women of this social class, more likely, as in this image here, oversaw the spinning and weaving done by members of their household. Loom weights in this period often were marked before the clay was fired, with impressions of objects such as gem seals from finger rings, dress accessories, and objects of bodily care that belonged to the female owner of the loom weights. So the weaving of textiles, therefore, reflected individual identities and perhaps family and social relationships. Textiles were true objects of status, as these images show, and I think we're all too often focused on objects of gold and other precious metals, of thinking of those as symbols of status. But textiles took a long time to make, to decorate, to dye, and wearing a lot of highly ornate clothing was a surefire indication that the person wearing these textiles was of upper-class status. Now, we don't have many textiles surviving, of course, from the 4th century, but I did want to draw your attention to one textile, a cloak, probably a ceremonial cloak, a fragment of which you can see on the lower left. 70 fragments of these finely decorated textiles in wool and also with linen embroidery were found in a semi-chamber tomb of a warrior used to wrap up his bronze belts in the early decades of the 4th century at Ordona in Puglia. And they offer a valuable insight into the richness of elite textiles. And so do, of course, the contemporary depictions in red figure vase painting from Apulia on the lower right, amazingly ornate textiles, and we can see in the tomb paintings as well, highly ornate, decorated textiles. By the early 3rd century, however, weaving for cash as an economic aspect of the family is established in southern Italy. Evidence suggests that traders delivered wool thread to the women in their homes, particularly women of the lower social echelons, paying them for their labor and selling the finished textiles as market products. So the 4th century may be perhaps the last century where we have it as a domestic industry rather than as an economic cash industry. Now, in antiquity, textiles and clothing were part of a social discourse, and particular garments, colors, patterns, and dress accessories were understood as non-verbal identity markers. Simply put, clothing enabled the expression of a group identity or an identification of an outsider, the us and the them, depending on what you're wearing. Equally, an alteration of dress behavior reflected a significant change of identity signaling. Ancient Greek and Roman historical sources refer to the population groups in southwest Italy, the area of my study, under large ethnic umbrella names such as Campanians, Samnites, and Lucanians. But these texts, written by others from a geographical, chronological, and cultural distance from the indigenous inhabitants of the region, contain very little information about daily life in southwest Italy and almost nothing about the clothing worn by people living there. It clearly was not of interest to the Romans. The 4th century is a crucial period here, as it was a century characterized by rivalries between southern Italic peoples and their struggles, most importantly, with an advancing Rome, causing stress and anxiety and leading communities to focus on identifying and re-identifying their identities in order to distinguish themselves from neighboring groups and, above all, from the Romans. And so, because textiles were important identity markers, this project I'm conducting has aimed to examine the physical evidence for textiles and clothing in the pre-Roman period, the 4th century BC in particular, when there are no texts referring to the clothing, but there is a wealth of archaeological evidence for them. Whilst southern Italic peoples did not record details of their clothing in writing, from about the middle of the 4th century and into the very early part of the 3rd centuries BCE, members of the upper social strata did depict themselves in their funerary paintings. A broader spectrum of society also had access to and were consumers of red figure pottery, such as this vessel in the middle, and these also have depictions of people in local dress. It is apparent how important textiles were, particularly highly decorated ones. So in view of the lack of surviving textiles and texts, these iconographic sources, a selection of which you can see on the screen, are a valuable and eloquent tool for exploring ethnic and cultural identities of the period, expressed by dress by the people who actually wore the clothing. Now, although the garments shown in these images might have been reserved for special occasions, in English we would refer to this as Sunday best, rather than being worn every day, they nevertheless reflect a reality and convey messages about social status, gendered roles, ideals, and identities. I also, in my study, have included dress accessories that were buried with the dead because they shed light, too, on the nature and materiality of clothing and the ways in which garments were ornamented and made to fit or visually accent the body. On the basis of pictorial sources and material culture from grave assemblages that I have studied thus far, it is clear to me that one of the ways that these identities were formed and expressed was through clothing and dress accessories, but this was done on a relatively local level rather than on a large scale or national level, as perhaps the Greek and Roman sources would have us believe. Discussions of indigenous dress in scholarship have focused largely on the depiction of the so-called Italic warrior. I will move on to him later. Female portrayals, on the other hand, have been grossly overlooked. In these tomb paintings, women perform household and family duties, all gendered activities, dressed in elaborate, multi-layered costumes and headdresses, and it is always the female attire that is more distinctive and informative about the origins and traditions of the deceased. And for that reason, I have found in my study that studying the depictions of women and their costume far more interesting and revealing. This is something in previous work on costume on the Roman frontiers of the Danube and the Rhine that I conducted also appeared. So it's a theme that repeats itself, that female clothing is more indicative of ethnic and cultural belonging. Claims have been made in literature thus far, when anyone pays attention to female costume, that women in southwest Italy wore some kind of national costume. For example, Oscan, or Samnite, or Campanian. But these claims are not based on any in-depth investigation of the material. In reality, female clothing types and headdresses varied noticeably in southern Italy from community to community, even though those communities might only be about 25 kilometers apart. And I hope to impress upon you that particular fact in the following. So the sites that I will be looking at this evening that have furnished tomb paintings and other material are Kumai, Kapua, Nola, Sano, Ponte Cagnano, and Pestum. And I'll start with Kumai. At Kumai, a Greek colony overtaken by Campanian forces in 421 BCE, and later acquiring Roman citizenship, but without the vote, in 338, portraits of men and women survive, alas, in only 2 painted chamber tombs from Fondo Correale, and you can see both of them at the top. They date to the very end of the 4th century. One of these, on the left, depicts a seated woman holding a mirror and a standing female servant who carries a wool basket, a kalathos, and an alabastron, or perfume flask, in the other hand. The other one on the upper right is decorated with figures of a reclining man and woman, dining in the presence of a female servant. Women wearing the clothing typical of Kumai are also depicted, as you can see on the lower right, in red figure vases that were produced in workshops in Kumai. And in tomb assemblages, we also have quite a lot of jewelry, gold jewelry in women's graves depicting the kind of dress accessories, in particular these bow fibulae that the women in reality wore. So the lady of Kumai wore a white sleeveless belted tunic with embellished borders on the neck and hem, and a broad decorative stripe running horizontally either the full length of the tunic or only from the waist to the hem. A broad belt that in the paintings is picked out in yellow paint, which probably suggests that it's a belt of bronze foil sewn onto a leather belt. She wears a short red cape fastened with a gold or silver bow fibula, 2 examples of which I show you here. And of course, the jewelry consists of multiple necklaces made of gold. The headdresses of women resembles a striped turban that narrows towards the top, leaving only a bit of the woman's hair visible on the temples and above the ears. These elaborate headdresses are portrayed also on red figure vessels, as you can see here. Now, when I was trying to understand this costume, there was something that greatly puzzled me, because quite often this textile that you can see draped on one hip in sort of a scallop shape was interpreted as part of the tunic pulled up and pulled over the belt. However, if you pull up part of the tunic and put it over the belt, the hem of the tunic would not be straight as it is here. So it appeared to me that this must be something separate. But what was it? What did it mean? And why was it there in the first place? Often in the vase paintings, and you can see 2 examples here, the women are wearing exactly that same textile that is worn with the belt, and they are shown extending a drink to a departing or returning warrior, their husband. For lack of a better term, I've referred to this textile as a hip textile, and I thought at the beginning that it might be a way of displaying the owning of multiple ornate garments, perhaps a clear and expressive symbol of wealth. But I've now come to believe that it also has another special meaning. To be noted is that the attributes held by the woman on the upper left, a mirror, and those held by the servant girl or younger companion, a perfume flask containing oils or ointments, a calathos for wool, relate to the female domestic sphere. And I think in this case, and I will argue for, this textile referring to a woman's preparation for her wedding. And one thing I decided to do with some of my master's students was reconstruct this costume, because it was the only way we could understand how these garments fit together and how they were worn. And this is a result of one of my master's students. This is a costume that we all spent several weeks sewing, embroidering, etc. And the result has shown beyond doubt that this is indeed a separate textile, a very fine textile. The presentation to or the holding of objects such as mirrors, birds, textiles, belts and veils included in that group, and boxes with gifts in them, as well as perfume flasks, is a common motif on Athenian pottery, decorated with scenes of wedding preparation. And here are a few of them, where you can see the bride seated, either already spinning wool in preparation for her role as a wife, or playing a musical instrument, where women come and bring her any number of gifts that fit really well into the types of objects held in the Campanian tomb paintings. Wedding preparation scenes are also common on South Italian red figure vases, on which women are attended to by other women, possibly the bridesmaids. And these women are given alabastra or ariboloi, the perfume flasks, boxes, textiles, a calathos, birds, or crowns. These scenes appear on vessels used in preparing the bride for her big day. These particular shapes, a lecanus, a lekithos, a lutrophoros, these are all ritual vessel shapes that have something to do with the ritual washing of the bride. They contained water that had been blessed, and so therefore it's a particular type of wedding vessel that's decorated with scenes of wedding preparation. Note also that both women in the tomb paintings from Kumai sit on an elaborate chair, also paralleled in red figure painting. Note furthermore that the bridal crown, resting on just such a luxurious chair on an Apulian lutrophoros in the middle, is depicted here in Matera. And you'll note that the woman on the upper right from Kumai is also wearing a floral crown, which I think pertains to her wedding attire, the floral crown, and her husband is wearing one too. The fact that the servant girl or younger attendant in the painting on the lower left here has a decorated tunic but does not have the luxurious extra textile is an indication of the high status and the special nature of the garment combination that was worn on this particular occasion in life, marking the transition from girl to wife. If bridal preparation is portrayed in that painting, the scene on the other painting from Kumai, upper right, whereas it might show the banquet after the wedding. So it is now husband and wife celebrating the wedding. She's sitting and with her husband enjoying food and drink, both wearing bridal crowns to allude to their new marital status. The extra textile worn on the hip, in my opinion, was a garment signaling the married status of a woman thereafter, keeping in mind that the woman shown sending off a warrior or greeting a returning victorious man in the red figure vase scenes is meant to be the man's wife. Perhaps what the hip textile really represents is the garment or cloak or veil worn by the bride, a bit like this Apulian depiction on the left and this Sicilian depiction of a bride on the lower right, worn over the head during the ceremony, but in preparation for it, and thereafter as a married woman, worn on the hip. Now let's move on to Kapua. Kapua was first an ally of Rome, then from 338 BCE, her subject. The assemblage of images, far more of them coming from Kapua than Kumai, indicates that women in Kapua and its territory in the last half of the 4th century wore a long belted tunic, commonly embellished with red borders and broad decorative stripes, running horizontally from the neckline to the hem. A broad belt, picked out in yellow, so probably bronze again. A short, slightly longer than waist length red cape that is fastened in the middle with a bow fibula, like those made of gold and silver in Capuan tomb assemblages. On the vase depictions, as you can see here, sometimes the capes are not depicted in red, but in white, and they seem to be of a softer fabric, almost with sleeves. But the cape is typical and an absolutely indispensable article of dress. A separate decorated textile here in Kapua is also worn by women in a similar way up to the fashion of female attire in Kapua, as you can see. And I have to thank one of my PhD students, Melissa Kays, for these drawings, because I'm afraid that many of these paintings, when they were discovered in the 19th or early 20th century, were not stored in proper conditions and they have disappeared. And sometimes all we have are old photos. And so we've had to work through those and redraw them and color them. And I think they give us a pretty good idea of what the costume looks like. I'd also like to draw your attention to this tufa statue from the major sanctuary outside the eastern gate of Kapua, where we have the so-called matres, about 160 statues of women, anywhere from about 40 centimeters to 2 meters, depicted holding 1 or up to 14 swaddled infants on their laps. And this woman here is wearing one of these capes, and you can see the large bow fibula. So we have the depiction in various media. And in these depictions, there are also scenes of bridal preparation at Kapua. This one on the upper left is almost certainly the case, where the woman is shown with a dove, she's holding a lotus flower, and her servant is bringing her wine. And even if we only have a single woman, she's holding the attributes and the kinds of things, including gift boxes, that we see from the bridal preparation scenes elsewhere. So I think that also here at Kapua, the draped hip textile is a garment referring to the wedding and to the marital status of the woman thereafter. So these garments and dress accessories from Kapua clearly are similar to those in Kumai, and at first glance, one might simply conclude that women in Kapua and Kumai wore identical clothing. But closer examination of the image, or the images, reveals that the headdresses are different. And you can compare them here, where we have the red turban with the black band at Kumai, this particular headdress from Kapua, which seems to be a cloth wound around the head in black with a red band and a bit of the headdress being pulled up underneath the band and falling down the back of the neck. And here's another example from Afragola, which belongs to the territory of Kapua. And I had the great pleasure of seeing this just as it was coming out of the restoration workshop in February in Naples. So it's very exciting to see that. The different headdresses of Kapua and Kumai, therefore, are a clue to the origin of the women wearing them. They're sending non-verbal messages, and they are signals. They are subtle to us because we're separated by over 2,000 years and unable to truly understand what is being signaled by the clothing. But by contemporary viewers, it would have been immediately obvious where women were from, based on clothing, but above all, based on the headdresses. Further east lie the towns of Nola and Sano. They are situated only 25 kilometers from each other, east of Vesuvius. Both towns were allied with the Samnites before being taken by Rome. In Nola, this took place in 313 BCE. Here at Nola and Sano, a set of female garments that was very different from those in Kumai or Kapua was displayed in the tomb paintings. The clothing ensemble that women wear in both Nola and Sano is similar, but it is not identical. In Nola, and here are the best examples now in the National Archaeological Museum in Naples, women are dressed in a straight, unbelted tunic in blue or yellow with a vertical embellished band in the middle of the tunic. And you can see that the embellished bands have different patterns. They also wear a short cape, usually in red, with distinctive decorated edges, and also tassels that dangle from the bottoms of the capes. Now, textile colors, you can see, vary quite a lot in these depictions, and the patterns and motifs on clothing vary as well. And those details were important markers of distinction, and I think perhaps even of kinship. Certain motifs may have been specific to family groups at Nola. The differing colors and patterns, for example, might have been passed on through the family from mother to daughter, and we can find that in ethnographic parallels even today in regions, for example, that I've looked at in the Alpine regions or in the Balkans, where costumes may look a little bit similar, but the particular embroidery mustard and colors indicate something very specific and identify someone coming from a certain clan or family. In Sano, women are dressed also in a straight tunic without a visible belt. However, they are sometimes shown in white or yellow and with an overtunic, as here. It almost looks like an apron, but it goes all the way up to the neck. They wear a cape in yellow or white, in addition to red, without decorative edges, unlike Nola, and they're fastened at the neck with a bow fibula. And if you squint, you might just be able to see the gold bow fibula here on that one. Now, it's difficult to know how fibulae actually held dresses together, because on these depictions, we only have the fibulae that hold the cape together at the neck. However, in one of the burials of the 4th century at Sarno, we can see an array of fibulae made of iron, bronze, and silver, all distributed in the shoulder and breast region. So perhaps those fibulae were holding clothing together underneath the cape. Although women, presumably of later status, both at Nola and Sarno, wear no headdresses, the headdresses of elite women from both towns consist of what usually looks like a red, close-fitting cap. You can see just a little bit of it appearing here, and again here. Very tight, almost like a skull cap or a beanie. And over that, there's a white or blue veil. The veil lies flat on the top of the head, as at Sarno, or can be tied in a knot at the back of the head, hanging straight down the back of the neck, as at Nola. This headdress is particularly distinctive, even in its subtle variants, and I have been able to identify it also on 2 red figure vases in the Louvre that clearly depict women from Nola or Sano. In addition to the typical headdress, the woman on one vessel also wears the short female cape of Nola and Sano. That's this one here, fastened with a bow fibula, which is visible here, and the long tunic adorned with a broad vertical stripe. So I would say she looks to me like a woman from Nola. The woman on the left, however, wears a belted chiton, which is a Greek garment, and we find a lot of women on Campanian and Lucanian vases that wear Greek costume as well. But she's wearing it belted, and she has a shawl wrapped around her back and arms, which is not a particularly indigenous style. But in the end, it's the very distinctive headdress more than anything else that signals these women's geographic origins. Interestingly, these 2 vessels on the left and the right were made by a painter from Pestum. And you might think that painters in Pestum would depict women wearing Pestum costume, but here they're showing women in Nolan and Sano costume. So it could very well be that vases, well, the painters were very aware of different clothing traditions in the region, and these might be special commissions for women from Nola or Sano made in workshops at Pestum. The site that has the largest assemblage of 4th century tomb paintings of men and women in local dress in southwest Italy is at Pestum and its territory. Several decades after the Oscan-speaking Lucani settled here, perhaps as a result of the long process of Italian migration rather than an invasion, around the turn of the 5th century BC at Posidonia, they began around 370 to paint their chest tombs, semi-chamber tombs, and chamber tombs in the cemeteries around the city with figural scenes that provide us with quite a lot of information on the dress and identity of these individuals. We have to keep in mind, however, that these tombs are in the minority. These really are depictions and tombs of the elite. Of the roughly 1,000 tombs at Pestum that have thus been discovered, only between 80 and 100 were painted. I'm afraid we can't do that kind of statistic for the other sites because the record is too patchy. We're in a better position to do that at Pestum. Now, women around the middle of the 1st century wear a particular costume that by the end of the 4th century, at Pestum, is considered to be rather old-fashioned. And this is the costume up here that appears only in the middle years of the 4th century, and it's a white tunic with red decorative borders. She wears a jacket or a cape that has short sleeves, and that's decorated with red as well. After about 440, 430, or 340, 330, that dress is no longer worn. Instead, what we find are much simpler versions of the long tunic, as you can see here, very rarely worn with a belt, usually not with a belt at all, in various colors, blue, red, black, with decorative borders running down the middle and along the hem. Women wear two different types of headdresses. They either wear this type, which looks like a kerchief knotted at the top of the head with a diadem in the front, or they wear this headdress, which looks kind of like a voluminous turban almost wrapped around the head with the back part of the fabric hanging down the neck. Pestum women also wore over that costume a cloak, and we can see a couple examples of it here where we can see the headdress and the diadem. This is a particularly informative one. This is a woman who's boarding a ship after her death to enter the other world. And so she's really dressed in her Sunday best and her finery, and note that she's wearing black. Throughout southern Italy, men often, I'm going to move on to the men now, men often are depicted as warriors on horseback, returning home after victory, underscoring the importance of the Italic cavalry nobility. They wear a 3-disc or muscle breastplate or cuirass, helmets with horns and feathers, a broad belt, and a short tunic, a surprisingly short tunic, about which many speculations have been written. All of the weaponry and armor are also found in grave assemblages, and you can see a couple examples here. This is an example from Ponte Cagnano, and this, I'm not sure where that's from, but I believe that's from Pestum. And you can see that costume very well on the portraits here from Pestum and Nola and Sano. It appears also on red figure vase painting, as here, the returning warrior on horseback. This panoply of weaponry and armor is traditionally known as Samnite, but I think we use the word Samnite a little bit too loosely, because neither Campania nor Lucania were part of the homeland region of the Samnites. Nevertheless, it's clear that the influence of military dress and weaponry of the Samnites can be detected here. Now, the Roman sources, of course, don't describe the clothing in this region at all, and they don't really describe the men, except for those men that they encounter on the battlefield. And let's face it, the Romans encountered the Samnites on the battlefield many, many times, and they had ample opportunity to examine them. And they refer to their tunics being brightly colored and mottled with different colors. They refer to gold and bronze armor, which might be a bit of a gold and silver armor, which might be a bit of an exaggeration. But anyway, the Romans were highly impressed with what the Samnites wore on the battlefield. I'm sure they would have been equally impressed by what the Campanian and Lucanian warriors wore on the battlefield. So we're very fortunate to have the visual sources from Campania and Lucania, because the Romans do not describe what the men wore. One exceptionally elaborately clothed warrior on a 4th century tomb painting in Kapua wears a cloak that is impressively decorated all over in gray, yellow, and red stripes, as well as small yellow rosettes. The men's clothing, for which we have the most visual evidence, are the tunics, the short, typical tunics. Both the paintings and the objects buried with the dead confirm that these were worn always with the bronze belt. The belt acted as a status symbol as well as an attribute of the warrior, and it is constantly paired with other status symbols, the tunics. Warriors from Nola in this painting display the greatest variety in tunics and textiles, wearing them in red or blue with elaborate borders in white, blue, or red patterns, sometimes with tassels hanging from the short sleeves. These are combined with a broad bronze belt and occasionally with muscle cuirasses and helmets with feathers or horns. In general, these depictions of the returning victorious warrior, when we see textiles such as these, highly decorated, these often have been interpreted as banners, much like a medieval army going into battle wearing or carrying big banners on the battlefield. If we look more closely though, however, as you can see here, these are clearly captured tunics. And they're worn or they're carried on a spear by the returning warrior. You can see how the tunic dips down in the front with tassels, just like the ones worn by men. Here are tassels on the sleeves, and the spears have been simply threaded through the neck hole and the sleeves. We have another warrior here who's returning on horseback. He has a spear, and what he's holding behind him is just a belt, whereas this man here has the tunic and the belt. What these depict are tunics as a trophy, a spoil of war, in addition to shields, greaves, or spears of a killed opponent. But it's the combination of tunic and broad bronze belt that is most symbolic of the elite warrior on either side of any conflict. And this, I think, explains why these items in particular are displayed proudly by the victor as proof of the kill, in perhaps hand-to-hand combat, almost certainly, and perhaps of an equally elite opponent who once owned them. So these are tunics that have taken from the bodies of slain enemies and brought home proudly. There can be little doubt that textiles such as these tunics communicated social status, and although they are largely similar in shape, length, and form throughout southwest Italy, they are distinguished by borders and applied bands in various patterns and colors. And you can see an example of tunics either brought back as a trophy, in this case from Kapua, in stripes, blue, red, white stripes. Here is another trophy, the soldier here wearing a bright blue tunic. And at Pestum we have this marvelous depiction where the upper part of the tunic is decorated with flying geese. And we have birds also on the shield. So they could also be an indication of someone's personal identity. There is no evidence that uniforms were worn by all Nolan or Capuan soldiers, let alone for a national Campanian or Lucanian livery. The tunic itself is recognizable as so-called Samnite or common to various groups, but there was great variety, as this slide shows. Some motifs, such as dots, wave patterns, might seem generic, but we can see with examples such as this that there is a great combination of motifs and colors that result in widespread diversity. The decoration we see here was something personal to the wearer and his immediate surroundings. The men from individual communities in Campania and Lucania, especially from elite families, as depicted in the tomb paintings, will have been responsible for their own clothing and armor, including their tunics, just as the early Roman forces in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE were, to cite but one parallel. As we've seen earlier, a woman's origin and membership in a particular community in southwest Italy could be recognized by her clothing and headdress, and that distinguished her from other women in other communities, be it Nola, Sano, Kapua, Kumai, or Pestum. But in addition to this, as I've suggested, patterns and motifs on female clothing could be important markers of distinction and even of kinship, or specifically to family groups. If identities were formed and expressed through clothing on a local level, as I think we can agree, rather than a large scale or national level, and we can demonstrate this for women, the same could be true of male military dress, in which there was much scope for personalization. So the different types of garments, as you can see, here's just a very small selection of the range of colors and patterns for tunics of that area. They are not only personalized to the men wearing them, they may represent something to their family or kin group as well. I just want to draw your attention also to images of the returning warrior carrying these tunics that are bloodied. Quite often they are blood smeared, very clearly proof of the kiln, and we have a blood smeared tunic up here with two leg protectors. And we can see it actually in action on this hydria from Kapua, where soldiers, this one on the left, he's got the full panoply here. He's got the shield, he's got the tunic, the belt, and the helmet of someone he's killed. The other one simply has, he has the shield and the leg protector. And here you can see the prisoner of war who's been stripped of his armor and is being marched off. The return of the victorious warrior is extremely popular in the 4th century BC. He displays one or more tunics taken from the bodies of his slain enemies, as we have seen, along with captured elements of body armor. By the end of the 4th century, however, the emphasis on elite warrior status and military prowess begins to diminish. Images of men engaged in battle, bloodied and injured, some of them are just full of spears stuck into them. It's pretty brutal. At the end of the century, we don't see that happening anymore. Instead, elite men, as you can see on the two images here at the bottom, might wear so-called civilian clothing, for lack of a better term. As here at Kumai, where this man on the right, the groom, I think, sports a tunic with embellished borders, over which an ornate cloak is worn. Also at Kapua, we have this now lost tomb painting of someone who's been referred to as a magistrate because he sits there in such dignity, and he's wearing an elaborate tunic over which he's wearing a cloak, he's holding a staff, and he's wearing a large ring which might indicate his civilian status, perhaps in government. The most interesting of the tomb paintings in this regard come from Pestum. They are exemplified in the Spinazzo cemetery at Pestum, and these all date to the period shortly before or after Pestum becomes a Roman colony in 273 BCE. Now we have elite men not coming back with spoils of war, bloodied tunics and armor and so on. What they do in these paintings, they wear the outward symbol of Roman civilian culture, they wear the toga. But it's interesting that they wear the toga over their highly embroidered native tunic, still with the belt, which no self-respecting Roman in Rome would ever have worn. So we're on the cusp of a group of people with a different cultural and civic alteration in their identity, now beginning to adopt Roman dress, which is not ethnic in this case, but is civic and cultural in nature. We see this worn by men and by boys, regardless of age. So we have civic identity expressed through the toga, but also by large finger rings. You can see one here, just like the man from Kapua, and they're wearing, in this case, not as bridegrooms, but as perhaps symbols of status, they're wearing floral crowns. In Pestum, also in the late 4th and early 3rd centuries BC, female clothing undergoes a change too, although it is much more subtle than with the depictions of men. In the tomb paintings of this period, the cloak, as an occasional article of women's dress earlier, now takes on special importance and becomes prevalent in funerary imagery. The covering of the head, the sedate posture, and the gesture of clasping hands with other women or men in these tomb paintings give the women an air of dignity and authority. The focus in the late tomb paintings at Pestum is on the salutation of men and of women of different generations and on the family. And in the tomb paintings of this period is the very first time we find children depicted. So it's much more about the family. And here, if you look closely, you can see, very interesting, a little Pestum warrior. So although his father might be dressed in a tunic, this little boy is wearing a short tunic which It almost looks like he's wearing a breastplate, but it's in bad condition, so I need to examine that in more detail. So we have civic leaders rather than the military elite, and the women representing the elite lineage. The medium of funerary portraiture in painted tombs all but disappears in Campania and Lucania in the early 3rd century. And I mean really goes down to a handful of examples. If we see such tomb decoration as here later on, a different picture of identities is presented. Local distinctive clothing appears to have been left behind in this later 3rd century painting from Ponticagnano. The site came under the control of Rome, and in 268 BCE, a new town known as Picentia was established here. The woman in this tomb painting is now dressed in Hellenistic or Roman clothing, which is common throughout the Mediterranean, either a chiton with a himation or something similar, but definitely not ethnic clothing of the region. And her male partner is wearing a toga. No trace of a local or ethnic identity can be discerned. This phenomenon is almost certainly tied to Rome gaining hegemony over southern Italy and establishing a new political order here in this period. Clothing such as that depicted in this painting therefore represents and expresses this social transition from Italic to Roman. As you can see, I have a large number of very talented people who do drawings for me. This is an archaeological illustrator, a highly talented man in Amsterdam, Kelvin Wilson, who has drawn, based on the sketches that I've given him, these colored drawings of the 5 groups that I've detected. And he's also at the moment preparing 30-centimeter high exquisite paintings of them, which we will use in publications and on the website. And I think they bring home the point that I was making, that there is great variety here from community to community. The clothing types are distinctive, they're multi-layered, the headdresses give a lot away, and they vary from community to community. So claims that women wore some sort of a national costume are unfounded. And it's interesting that it's always women who express local identities, while men's costumes appear to have been more broadly similar, apart from perhaps the decorated tunics. Women and girls, we can see that at Pestum, throughout the 4th century wore their local clothing, thereby conservatively sustaining and perpetuating traditional dress identities. And I think those dress identities, I look for parallels in the later Roman period on the northern frontiers, that those identities were passed on maternally through the family line or clan, rooted in a community and audience of peers and others of the same origin. So these images painted for perpetuity indicate that women were the primary bearers of local identities in funerary representation and in life. Now, the clothing worn by women in southwest Italy almost certainly did not appear suddenly in the 4th century BC. It must be a continuation in some form of earlier clothing traditions for which physical evidence of textiles is extremely rare. It was the self-confidence of the communities, or the elites of the communities, I should say, and their interest in depicting themselves in a display of funerary luxury on the walls of tombs that provides a very rare window on clothing and identity that had not existed before this time. Therefore, the tomb paintings, and indeed the vase paintings, simply render identities based on sartorial criteria visible. And I will just finish with this slide, going back to what I said at the beginning about Greek and Roman sources describing ethnic identities. And these sources are very cavalier and very sloppy in using ethnic groups with large labels, or they admit to us that they take little care in distinguishing groups from each other. Here we have a lovely quote. As far as the Lucani are concerned, we don't need to take too much care in distinguishing them from their neighbors, the Samnites, because we don't care really. They're not us, the us and them. Stereotypical ethnic labels such as Campanians or Lucanians, I think, based on the visual evidence I've presented today, do not accurately reflect the collective identities apparent in the archaeological record, and certainly not on the basis of dress and ornament witnessed in the visual sources and material culture record. And they should, therefore, be used with extreme caution and I think rejected. Now, of course, the Romans knew that the peoples of southwest Italy had different customs. They knew they had different histories and cultures and that they dressed differently, but as I said, they really were not of very much interest to them. So when Strabo, the Greek geographer writing in the early 1st century AD, laconically states that these characteristic aspects of the Lucani, language, armor, dress, and the like, have completely disappeared, they truly had disappeared long before that time. But that's all he's willing to say about them. He acknowledges that they existed, but they're gone now, and there's no point in describing them. How lucky we are, therefore, in having the visual and archaeological evidence left in the 4th century BC by the communities of Campania and Lucania. Thank you very much.